Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle, books, and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is April 5th, 2019. Greetings to you from downtown Denver. Our sedate adult high-rise condo here in Lodo is going to undergo a big change tomorrow, Saturday, April 6th. That's because my daughter Rue, husband Mike, and their two sons, Jake 5 and Ryan 3, are going to arrive at Denver International Airport at around 10:30 tomorrow for a 4-day visit. Since we don't have a car here in Denver, I rented a minivan from Enterprise for their stay. In Cambridge, in our home in Cambridge, Rue and Mike and the boys are our next-door neighbors, so it's really going to be fun to have them looking out of these high windows at the downtown and the Rockies. It's a very different world from their leafy residential home back in Cambridge. Visiting different worlds is an experience that lovers of fantasy fiction enjoy. I learned that firsthand in the last few weeks while reading Theft of Swords, the first of two fantasy series by Michael J. Sullivan. It's a deeply creative task to create an entirely new world set centuries ago, populated by humans, wizards, and elves. Tolkien did it, of course, and Michael J. Sullivan has extended the genre with his own unique sensibility, one that displays an impressive devotion to his readers. Unlike some fantasy novels, his do not begin with lengthy history and geography lessons orienting the reader for the rest of the story. He learned from mysteries and suspense novels to jump right in with characters and action that draw a reader into his new world page by page.
When you're writing it, the world should just build in the background. You should get to know it by experience, not having to be told in page after page and getting a whole world history, because that's boring and people tend to skim that kind of stuff.
Also this week, reports of an Alexa competitor to Apple's AirPods, a divorce announced by Twitter, and a tech tip for your physical book library. First up in news this week, Bloomberg had a report of a competitor to Apple's AirBuds that would work with Alexa. And the report is fairly specific. It says that it's likely to come as early as the second half of this year. They also kind of suggest that September is a time that Amazon tends to release new hardware products. That certainly would fit to get it out before Christmas. This is being developed apparently at Lab 126, which is where the Kindle got its start, and all of the rest of the hardware that Amazon has created since then. They are trying to get better audio quality than AirPods, and it's going to have a case which can also charge it, and there'll be a micro USB cable that charges the case. I have the AirPods second generation, which just came out recently, and they have 50% longer battery life. I think they're supposed to be faster. I haven't really noticed that. The big difference with them is that instead of having to tap to get Alexa, you can just say, or Siri, you just say, "Hey Siri," and then Siri will do all the things that Siri can do. That means that if this description is right, the AirPods second generation are going to be a lot like the Alexa pods, because you're going to be able to just say Alexa and do things with your pods. Now, the Alexa AirPods are going to have to be paired with a smartphone, iPhone or an Android, and I don't know if you're going to be able to pair them with Echo speakers. I don't know why that would have any benefit, because if you can talk to the speaker, why would you use the AirPods? Not clear exactly how this would work, especially if you use Siri for things. You're certainly not going to switch pods in your ears depending on which AI you're talking to. But it's being portrayed in this story as a significant entrance into wearables by Amazon. Pretty interesting story. Second story in the news this week, in January, Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos said that they were separating and going to divorce, and the divorce was finalized by tweet, a little unusually. They created a special Twitter account for Mackenzie. It doesn't have anybody that she's following, and she just put up a single tweet that said that the divorce was final, and then he retweeted her tweet with some very supportive words. They were supporting each other and ending this marriage in a way that, at least at the public level of Twitter, it didn't have much rancor in it, which is good to see, given that some of the other coverage of Jeff's adventures in the last few months that could conceivably have meant the divorce would have a little tougher tone to it. The part that the markets were probably looking at is that he retains all voting power over the stock that they had together. They had 16% of Amazon stock. She is going to get 4% of it, and that'll be worth $36 billion, making her, by one report I saw, the third richest woman in the world. He keeps 12%, and that'll be worth $107 billion. And he's got all the voting rights to the stock, so there are no changes in his ability to manage Amazon based on that amount of stock that he owns. The stock price for AMZN didn't show any reaction to this, so I think it all played out the way the market hoped it would. Wish them both well. She's certainly going to have an interesting new period of her life on what does she do with $36 billion. She's a novelist, quite a good novelist, and now she's a woman on her own with quite a fortune. For the tech tip, I had an interesting exchange with a listener named Jennifer Schuchman, Schuchmann. Jennifer wrote, Dear Mr. Edgley, I saw your name on a Recommendo newsletter and have since visited your site. Impressive body of work. I know that you don't do tech support, but I am hoping that with your love of creativity and your knowledge of the Kindle that perhaps you've discovered a solution to my problem and covered it in one of your podcasts where I could learn how to do it. I want to print out the book covers of all the books on my Kindle. I have a rather large library of print books, and ideally I'd like to stick a laminated picture of my Kindle books in the location on my bookshelf where the physical book would go if I owned it. This way, when I am doing a visual search of a topic in my physical bookshelves, I'll be reminded of the related books in my Kindle. I often buy whichever version is on sale, and sometimes I buy both. As a result, I can have books on my Kindle that I never read because I've forgotten they are there. I also like the idea of being able to physically sort books into piles of research I am doing, books on craft or books for reading pleasure, and then organize them into a reading list based on my current interests. While there are ways to do this on the Kindle, collections, etc., I find it's not the same as being able to sort, stack, and shuffle books in the same way I am used to doing physically. I am hoping that perhaps you have covered this topic on your podcast and could refer me to a specific episode where you cover how to do this or something similar. Again, I apologize that this probably isn't the kind of question you respond to, but I've been unable to find a solution elsewhere, and I'm hoping you perhaps your experience will turn up something I have overlooked. I replied to Jennifer telling her I loved her question because I thought it showed that she's a kindred spirit with a lot of listeners and myself. So her love of books in both forms, paper and ebook. And I love the idea of kind of putting something into her physical bookshelves that would flag her to remind her that she has some ebooks on a certain title. What I came up with was a pretty simple idea, and I tried it using my iPhone XS Max. I pulled up a Kindle book from my library, and I navigated to the cover of it. Then I simply took a screenshot, which on the iPhone, I pressed the button on the right of the phone and at the same time the up volume button on the left. That makes a screenshot of whatever's on the screen. It would be easy from there to take that image of the book cover and transfer it to my computer, maybe drag it into a Word document, just some way to print it, perhaps on high-quality photo paper, and then laminate it in a way that it would have some kind of durability to slide into the library. I also sent the question along to Amazon, but I got an answer of a general nature that wasn't precisely helpful in answering Jennifer's question. She wrote after receiving my idea, "Thank you so much for your quick reply. I actually like your suggestion to take a photo of the cover. Accessing my Kindle content list on the Amazon website, it's just a couple of clicks to get to the cover and save it. I think it will be an easy and monotonous task to do while watching a movie or listening to a podcast or Audible book. Then I can print them out in any form that I want. While it will still take a bit of time, I am sure I have already wasted equal amounts of time looking for other solutions. Thank you so much for your suggestion." So that's a happy outcome there, an idea The underlying idea is one that maybe you would have some interest in if you would like to have some signifying actual physical thing in your book library that tells you where among them you've got Kindle books. So thanks for that great question, Jennifer. If you have a tech tip question that you think I might be able to help you with, you can send it to me at podchronicles@gmail.com. Michael J. Sullivan's novels have sold at least 1.5 million copies, mainly in the fantasy genre. He did write one sci-fi novel. I heard about him from listener Szymon Schott in Krakow, Poland, who thought I would be interested in him, partly because he is a hybrid author, having published with two of the big five publishers, Hachette and Penguin Random House, as well as on his own. Sullivan has also garnered impressive backing on several Kickstarter projects that raised money to help him publish his work. I reached Michael on April Fool's Day at his rustic cabin in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Since his latest Kickstarter project was just finishing, I began by asking about that part of his work. I learned a lot about Kickstarter as a tool for authors, but you might find this topic a bit dry, and if you want to skip ahead about 10 minutes, that's the part where we will start talking about the rich imagined world of his Riyria series and his philosophy of writing for an audience of devoted fans. This first part of our conversation begins with how he and his wife Robin came to use Kickstarter as a tool for publishing and promoting his books.
The reason why we started doing Kickstarter in the first place was due to the fact that at the time we had just gotten published through New York, and I knew a number of other authors who had gotten published, and they had a 3-book series, and the first book did not so great. The second book did worse. And when they got to the third book, New York didn't want to pick them up for that next title. And they had a number of fans who wanted to get, the last book, but there was no way for them to publish it. And so what I suggested was, because I had actually started, in a small publisher, but then I did the bulk of my early work in self-publishing. So I told them, I said, well, you can always self-publish. And there were no, we can't do that. I'm not good at publishing. And even if I did, I wouldn't have the money. And I said, well, you can kickstart it. You can do that. And they said to me, no, that's not going to work because, I would never be able to be a success. I said, you have fans. You have a fan base. That's who you're trying to get the book out to. So all you have to do is contact them. They will essentially pre-order the book, which will give you the money to produce it and get it out there. And they were not – I couldn't convince them. It was just not possible. So as an experiment, I decided to try this because I had written a science fiction novel, and most of my books are fantasy. And so I wrote a science fiction novel, and my publisher was not interested in picking it up, which was fine because, like I said, I had a background in self-publishing. Although just, it's okay with them if I self-publish it, great. So in order to launch that, we did the experiment. I didn't have to do it, but I wanted to see how it would work so that I could go to these other people and explain to them if it worked or if it didn't. And so we did what was known as Hollow World at the time, and I launched that Kickstarter. As it turned out, I learned a couple things. First of all, it can be done. Second of all, you can actually we blew it away. I think we worked out how much we wanted for that. We figured how much money it was going to cost, and then I cut it in half and said I would put up half, and I would get half from them. And we were only looking for like $20,000, I think. And that, well, we made way over that. But the thing I really learned about that was not only can you get funding for the project, but almost nobody backed that project who was a fan of my books.
Huh.
And the interesting thing is when you're self-publishing or even if you're traditionally publishing, it's often hard to get outside of your own echo chamber. People who know about you is great. You're working in this enclosed ecosystem. But when you want to get more people to discover you want to get out of that pond. And that's the hard part. Well, Kickstarter gives you that option by being able to relate to Kickstarter people who just love looking through Kickstarters and love backing things. And so I actually got a whole new group of readers just directly from working through Kickstarter, this was a happy accident. We didn't plan this. So now I was able to go back and tell people, look, see, this is a viable option, and it has worked for that. Now, most recently, I left Orbit and went over to Del Rey on the problem that I wanted my next book to be released in hardcover, and they were not willing to do that. They didn't feel for some reason that that's what I should be doing. But when I went to Del Rey, I asked them, and I said, I won't sign a contract with you unless you be doing a hardcover. And they said, well, of course we're going to do a hardcover. What? It makes sense to do a hardcover. I'm like, oh, well, great, because that's not what I had been told before. So we did the first few books in the Age of Legends series in hardcover, which was great. But now I was doing self-publishing books for my Riyria series, and I wanted to do hardcovers for those as well. Now, hardcover printing is a whole different thing besides doing direct press if you're going through Amazon. And if you don't understand, that's when someone buys it, and when they buy it, it is made. It is not doesn't exist until you purchase it. So in that, it's a very safe bet, right? I mean, the book isn't even created until you do it. But when you're doing a hardcover run, it has to be done in advance. You have to do an actual print run, and that costs money. That's why the books tend to cost a lot more, is because the whole binding process is considerably more expensive. So in order to do hardcovers for my prequel series, I decided to do another Kickstarter. And we put out one for, I think the first one was Death of Dulgath. And that one, again, we estimated, actually I forget the number we estimated for, but again, we sold far more than I had anticipated. So that proved that system as well. And I think we did one for the follow-up book, which was Winter's Daughter. And part of this was to raise the money, the capital, to essentially do that print run in advance so that then people go. So essentially it's just them pre-ordering my book, which gives me the money to make it. But the other thing, like I said, is it continued to grow. People who had never heard of me were like, oh, I've heard about this thing. I want to jump into this. And people love the idea that they are part of it, that they get to, be a backer, that they helped bring this to life. And the interesting thing of that is not only did we get new eyes on me as a writer, but also people who backed it said to themselves, I love this project. This is my project too. And they would go out and they would leave reviews. They would talk it up. I had cheerleaders free of charge. So, and they would, like I said, they would read it because they would get the book in advance of everyone else intentionally, because I'm now, giving my book, or selling my book, in fact, to people who are already predisposed to like it. Which is wonderful if you're trying to sell a product. So these people would read my books, want to give it a good review because they want other people to know about the great project that they're invested in. So for the first 6 months, these people were putting out good reviews, they're talking it up, and I had a lot of nice buzz as a result of that. Now, the most recent one that I did was because I was working through Del Rey, as I said, but Del Rey had an issue where they were having corporate came down and decided all books or all deals must include audio, ebook, and print. They won't do a deal otherwise. Well, as it turned out, when I went to them originally, I had already told them that I had sold the audio rights to all of these books. So we had a contract for the first 3 books of the series. The next 3 books we did not have a contract for. So when it came around to doing those next 3 books, while they were fine not having an audio for the first 3 books, the second 3 books, they required the audio. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but we don't have that anymore. So that was like, okay, well, unfortunately, they were happy with us. We were happy with them, but we could no longer do business because of corporate law. As a result of that, what I wanted to do now was I wanted to not make my readers upset, because these books were coming out in hardcover and they were high quality. And I did not want them to get the 4th book in a 6-book series and have it not match the first 3. So what I did was I talked to Del Rey and we did research, and we found out exactly who their printer was, what paper they used, what font they used, and we had the artist Mark Simonetti who had done the cover for the previous books, and we wanted to replicate the process completely. So as a result of that, again, we were going to need a little bit more money to make sure that this all came into being. So for the last Kickstarter, again, we went out and we presented once more and said we want to fund this. And as it turns out, again, we ended up making go see it's like $110,865, and we had 2,553 backers. And at the time, I think it was the number 3 or number 4 highest funded fiction project that Kickstarter's had done.
And your goal for that was like 25,000 or something?
Well, no, this one was a little bit higher. I forget. I had to look at it, but I forget. My wife, like I said, she's the one who does most of my business stuff. I try to stay out of her way.
Yeah.
I had an advertising agency for a while, and once I got it off the ground to the point where I was actually making more money than she was at her engineering job, I immediately hired her to be the president of my company because she's so much better at this.
But anyway, you far exceeded the goal of this most recent one.
Oh, yes. We have done that. In fact, the first... Every one of the projects that I've done have ranked in the top 10 or top 20 when they're being completed.
Well, and when you described the Kickstarter project for this most recent one, you said that you had checked and you would be able to get a loan from the bank to do this, and but it looks like you certainly didn't have to get a loan to the bank, and plus there was some extra money. What were you able to do for your readers with the more money that you raised than you would have needed to for the original purpose?
Well, a lot of it was, there were additional things we provided for them. One of them, which is kind of interesting, we actually have some people actually come to the cabin here.
Yeah, I saw that.
They spend a weekend. That was one of the more unusual little tidbits that we have, and they'll be coming soon. But those are kind of fun, and but there's other little perks. One of the things, they get the book in advance, and then there's graphic novels and things, and the short stories that I produced that were all thrown into the mix at different levels. Like I said, the real mastermind here would be my wife, and I'm disappointed she's not here at the moment to give you a lot more detailed explanation on how the Kickstarter worked.
Michael Sullivan has been at his writing for a long time, so I shifted at this point to ask him about the beginnings of his writing career.
I first started trying to get published around 2007. I had an agent, went to every publisher. They all rejected me. Finally, my wife at the time decided to self-publish it because she really felt, she was confident it was going to do well. But this was before the Kindle. This was before ebooks. So we were literally going to print them up and sell them out of the trunk of our car kind of thing. And we had printed up 300 copies of the book when we happened to look in our email and discovered 3 months prior to that, a very small company publisher in Minnesota wanted to publish me. It was kind of disappointing because my wife went to all this trouble to learn how to do this, and just as she's about to launch, you can't do it anymore. So she ended up giving seminars in Washington, D.C. At local libraries just to tell everyone else how to do this.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be good because, like I said, after that first publisher, they printed the first book, and then they kind of had financial problems to where they couldn't do the second one. So we bought back our rights and we started self-publishing. And right about the time in 2008, which is when the Kindle was first released, I think it's in April, which was the month I released. So my first self-published book came out the very month that the Kindle was open, widespread. So that's how that got started. So yes, 2008 is when I started really self-publishing my books. I was then picked up by Orbit in 2010, although the books didn't actually get released until November of 2011. And so it was, and I had 3 books because they're already done. They released them in succession 1 month after the other one. So one came out in November, then December, and then the last of the 3 books was in December of 2012.
And this was an imprint of Hachette, right?
That's correct, yes.
Fast forward to where you are now. It looks like you've sold over 1 million books worldwide. What's the total impact of your books and the success in finding audience so far?
Well, I think technically I've sold, about 1.5 million English. I have no idea worldwide. I mean, I'm published in, I think it's something 16, 17 different languages. I have 87 different contracts all over the world. Most of those are hard to track because they don't have the same accounting that we do in the United States. So it's hard to track. I think anyone who's going to be doing that is difficult because I have multiple foreign agents and they're handling it differently. So I have no idea. I couldn't tell you how many I have across the world, but I know I have at least 1.5 million sold at this time.
Well, let's talk about the world that you created that has generated this kind of interest among your readers. I took your suggestion and I started reading Theft of Swords, which is the first of the Riyria series. And then as you go forward, the next series actually takes you back in time to that. And then the most recent one goes even further back. But this idea of creating a world and then putting as much effort into it as you have put into it to have everything match among the different books. If you were going to describe this world that you've created to someone, what is it like? What's somebody going to experience if they devote the time to become someone who really is a traveler and almost a resident of this world when they're reading your books?
Well, for the most part, it's primarily very similar to medieval Europe, which is a lot of the basis of many fantasy books ever since Tolkien. I wasn't particularly trying to do anything unusual or original in that respect. My intention had been that I was reading fantasy novels, or I had gotten away from it for a long time when I was learning how to write. I actually didn't read fantasy for a long time, but when I came back to it, I encountered one problem that I kept bothering me, which is there was this history class that you had to take at the beginning of every book, which before you got into the story, before you even knew whether you liked the author or would like the story or the characters, you had to have this massive amount of information. You had to take a class in history about the world. And most of the books started that way. They would have the obligatory open the book, and it begins with, in the year of the great god Argoth, before the great reign of... And you would go on for several pages like that. And I kept thinking, is there going to be a character trying to do something at any point in the story? And I actually picked up some thriller books and, these detective novels or whatever. And they start off and they immediately grab your attention and they hold it through the whole story. It's like the author recognizes that it's their responsibility to entertain you. Whereas a lot of the people I felt with fantasy were like, no, they felt their responsibility was to make this very in-depth world that had so many facets that it would seem, once you had read 5 or 6 of their books, it would seem real. And there are many people in fantasy who read fantasy for that very reason. I was not one of them. I think if you love a character and a story, then eventually, because you just love it so much, you want more information. At that point, yes, all that detail is wonderful. But you're not going to get to that point until you are invested. So the idea I had was that if I started off with a very simple story with 2 very simple characters, easily understood and set in a place that was easy to comprehend, knights, kings, castles, all these things everyone knows about. I don't have to explain them to you. Mm-hmm. So it's not a different language. And I can just tell you about a very small story about these 2 men who are thieves. One is a cynical thief, and the other one is a more idealistic fighter. They're teamed together. They're hired to steal a sword. When they get there, they find the dead body of the king and realize they're in trouble because they've been set up to take the fall for it. And there's just a very simple story. Everyone can follow that and get interested in it, and they understand the problem that these people have right now. And I don't have to tell you anything about the world. But as I progress in the story, the world has to bubble up because I have to explain this or that just by logic, just by putting one block upon another. Simple things such as, I was struck by the fact that if you read Hemingway, you'll find that he almost never describes his characters. But you come away with an understanding of what they look like. And I figured, how do you do that? And it's just very subtle. It's like Bob said looking up to Jack. Mm-hmm. Now you know that Jack is taller than Bob. Even though you may not even have consciously picked up on it, you just got that information. And the same thing applies for fantasy in my respect, that when you're writing it, the world should just build in the background. You should get to know it by experience, not having to be told in page after page and getting a whole world history, because that's boring and people tend to skim that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I like to try and write so that if people skim, they'll totally ruin the book because I'll miss them. And I try to make everything entertaining enough that they won't want to. Mm-hmm. So that was what I was trying to do. But the world I created was very simple, like I said, medieval kings and so on and so forth. And there is magic, but the magic is kept very kind of low-key. Because when I read The Lord of the Rings, I was fascinated. If you go back through there's very little magic in it. I mean, it hardly ever appears. Even the wizards, that when they're doing magic, it's a small thing. Most of the story doesn't revolve around it. You know that this is a magical place. There's magical things that go on, but you don't really see too much of it. But when you do, then it's huge because it is so unusual. It's so dramatic. And that was what I was going for. I wanted to have a very realistic world of kings and queens and all that kind of stuff with magic that is kept in a very kind of your back pocket. And when that comes out, you have a sense of awe. I also didn't want to write from the sense of kings and queens. I literally wanted to have that world, but I'm going to talk about this little guy on the street who's having a bad day. And then from there, it gets bigger, and the world blossoms and the story blossoms till at some point what started off as a simple little sword and sorcery story that could almost have been like a short story suddenly becomes this massive epic world and this massive epic story. And you're not really sure when that happened. It snuck up on you. But you know the world, you know what's at stake, and it's a massive story. But that's sort of the subtle thing I try to slip in.
Your two characters, Royce and Hadrian, who I'm getting to know in the first book, do they continue all the way through the Riyria Revelations and Chronicles? So
the Riyria Revelations, and I'm impressed you actually said that correctly. You must have heard this somewhere. A lot of people have trouble with that word. So the Riyria Revelations is a 6-book story, and it begins with, like I said, that the stealing of that sword and ends with the completion of this massive event, which I won't go into. So when I got done with that, my wife said, that was great. I want to read more about these guys. And she said, it's not fair that you can think about them anytime you want to, and I can't have time with them.
Well, and she particularly liked one of them, Hadrian, right? She had kind of a crush on him.
She liked both of them, but yeah, she liked him most. And so what I did was, when I finished the series, I wrote it specifically so that it had what I thought was the best possible ending a book could have. Because literally, I have hundreds of different characters, and you find out what happens to every single one. It's all tied up in a neat little bow at the end, so that there's nothing that anyone should ever have a problem with after that, because it's such a beautiful ending. So I didn't want to go beyond it. I didn't want to have a sequel. I didn't want to jump the shark and just keep having more and more things for Royce and Hadrian to do, because each book in that series it's better than the last one, and I did it intentionally, which is actually stupid, because you want the first book to be really good to get readers. I didn't do that. The first book is the weakest, and it keeps getting better as you go along, and the stakes kept getting higher. So when I get to the last one, it's huge. There's no way I could follow that up with a bigger, more dramatic, fun book, and if I don't, then there'll be a disappointment.
Yeah.
Right? So instead of that, the main characters, one of the other things that happens in fantasy is it happens so often, it's amazing. It's also one of my pet peeves, is that almost all fantasy books start with a child character, and you show how they grow up and they come of age and something happens. And even the ones where you start with them as an adult, you have flashbacks to see how they got there. And I don't know of any other genre that does that. I mean, what's wrong with being an adult? You can make comments about being a child at one point, sure, but you don't go to the effort of actually showing the childhood. It's silly. I mean, I didn't get to see how great Gatsby was born.
Yeah.
So this was silly to me. And so I didn't want to go that far. But what I wanted to do was my characters had been together for 12 years. They knew each other really well. They were friends for a long time, and they had a lot of back history. So I could pull on, old jokes they had with each other and make it seem like they had been together for a long time. But when my wife wanted more stories, I said to myself, well, I have 12 years they were together.
Right.
So I could actually drop some prequels in there. And what I thought was, a number of people have written to me and said, they couldn't believe how these two characters who were so different from one another could ever have become friends. So that, to me, was a challenge. So I'm like, yes, I will now show you how this happened. And there was a few other questions that people had asked, like, why does Hadrian have 3 swords, and so on and so forth, and that seems absurd. So I wanted to explain all these little legendary things. So I wrote the first book of being When They Met.
The Crown Tower?
Yeah, the Crown Tower. That was fun. 'Cause that was fun to show kind of the origin story. If there were superheroes, that's the origin story. I kind of felt that you kind of need that. People would like to see how that occurred. And then I wrote, and that was sort of a 2-book series because that rolls into the second book very neatly. So those first 2 books are almost like one story, although they take place 1 year apart. So then I wanted to take those first 2 years, and I thought, well, I could actually write a book, one for every of the 12 years. They were together. So that was kind of the idea. What I didn't know was people hate prequels. I didn't know this, but this is one of the reasons why my publisher was not so thrilled with me doing prequels. But I guess it had something to do with the whole Star Wars movie thing that kind of set people off. And I guess he wasn't the only one. There's some people who have done. And people don't like knowing that the characters are going to live. Or I guess also when people are doing a prequel, they're just kind of going through the motions to make more money just based off of the information that they already gave out. So, but that's not what I did. I actually wrote a complete story. And as it turned out, people loved the prequels. So I didn't fall into that trap, and they've been very well received. So those were the first ones, and I've got 4 out of, I think there should be a total of 10 of them to account for all the years. And they're doing very well. Those are the ones I said I was kickstarting to do the hardcover. So I can't do the first 2 because those are owned by Orbit, but everything after that has been released in hardcover and paperback.
Did you model Rice and Hadrian on parts of yourself? Did they each represent parts of yourself?
Yeah. Pretty much every character I write has a little bit of me into it. I often refer to it as being like real magic. There's illusions where you can kind of fake things, but then if you really want to affect a reader, you have to go in and use real personal feelings and real personal ideas. With them, yes. In fact, it's kind of funny because Royce is my bad side and Hadrian is my good side. And there was one time my wife was sick and she was in the hospital, and she called me and let me know, and I was coming down. She says, "Oh, and please bring Hadrian, not Royce." That's good. Because she knows what happens when Royce comes out. So she says, please bring Hadrian, not Royce. So yeah, those 2 I do drop on it. And Hadrian's my better half. He's the person who I am when I'm good, and Royce is the person when I get really irritated. Like one time, my daughter was hit by a car, and it was my daughter's fault. She was riding a bike with my wife, and she pulled right out in front of an oncoming car. Oh dear! And an elderly couple they weren't going very fast, but she flipped over the hood and everything, and they stopped. They got out. They took care of her. They got her, and they drove her home so I could take her to the hospital. Got to the hospital, and the doctor there insisted that I fill out a police report about these 2 people because they were going to have to, talk to a police officer about hitting this kid. And I said they're not involved in it. It wasn't their fault. We're good. And he says, "No, you absolutely have to do this." To which I said, "No, I absolutely don't." And suddenly, Royce started coming out of this point.
Good.
And I was a little bit angry with the circumstances. I'm like, this is not a time to be pressing me. And yet he was insisting that I was going to have to fill out a police report, saying that I might want to sue them. Yeah. And at that point, I got really kind of angry, and I think I may have threatened his life. That's Royce, and that's the thing which I don't like too.
Is he the one that has 3 swords?
No. He's the one who doesn't appear to have any weapon. He has a dagger, but he doesn't actually appear to have one. He's the person whose solution to everything is the easiest solution is just to kill the person.
Yeah, that's right. We just kill him.
Why not? He is exactly that individual who, in a horror film, when you stab the bad guy and he falls down, he's like, "Oh no, don't stop there." Yeah. Cut his head off and then burn the carcass and so on and so forth, because we don't take chances. Hadrian is the person who would be noble and honorable and say, "Oh, I knocked you down. Now I will help you up because now we must be friends because we've settled that." But not Rice. Rice is just vicious and cold.
Well, I can see the benefits of that. You have a place to put those parts of you that if they sneak out into a marriage or real life, they could cause trouble. But in a fantasy story, they can just make the reading really fun. Yes, I also had one situation where I had a bunch of people reading my books, and they were talking afterwards. And the conclusion of all the women in the readers group was they all loved Hadrian, but Royce was hot. Yeah. That was one of the weirdest things. I'm like, I wrote a character who's hot. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a good sign. It had to come from somewhere. Yes. Well, this is fantastic. I tell you how I heard about you. I have a listener in Krakow, Poland, Szymon Schott, and he has been after me for months to try to track you down for a conversation. And his observation caught my eye. He said that your commitment to readers is striking, and he told the story. This must have been Hollow World. You had some profanity, and you knew that some of your readers might mind, so you released 2 versions of the book. One for people that didn't mind strong language, and
not really as much as you might think. So when I wrote Riyria, when I'm setting this story in a medieval historic period, I don't use modern day profanity because it seems so terribly out of place. It would be like using the word dude. I mean, it's just it's too modern to me, because for me, most of the profanity is stuff that we very first heard in a Martin Scorsese film in the late 60s, early 70s. So it locked into such a modern era that I just didn't use it. I substituted it for the most part with English profanity, what you would see in the old movies. That was fine with me. Also, I kind of, to some degree, was writing it for my daughter who had dyslexia, and so I obviously wasn't going to fill it with a lot of sex or graphic violence or profanity. So when I wrote those, it wasn't that I was trying to do that specifically. It was just something I didn't feel any need for it. I mean, sex in the book really wasn't going to move the plot forward, so I didn't see any time to spend, you wouldn't show people going to the bathroom either because it doesn't move the plot. So neither one of those things were necessary. Well, people got to like that about my writing, because apparently in fantasy there is a great deal of sex and profanity and so on and so forth. I didn't even know that, because I'm used to the older stuff where they didn't have it either. So this just became something that readers of mine expected from me, and so many people thanked me for it that I was like, uh-oh, because when I'm writing Hollow World takes place in the real world contemporary age, and I'm trying to make certain statements with that story, and those people in that story would be profane in their language. So when I wrote that, I wrote it honest to what it should be. But then I realized a lot of my readers wouldn't like it. So when I made the Kindle, when I made the ebook, I simply did a search and replace and then profanity. Didn't take that long. Mm-hmm. And then I loaded both of those books into the ebook, so that you simply, you get both books. You just simply start you click on the link that takes you to the beginning of the book that you want to read.
Cool.
Now, this kind of irritated people because they would get to the end of the book and it would show so much more to go, but that's just the second.
You don't know.
So that kind of annoyed them a little bit. But for the most part, you had 2 books in your possession at all times. So it really wasn't that much of an extra effort on my part, but it really did provide the readers with a solution to this problem that they just didn't want to read that. I'm like, fine. Well, then you don't have to.
Huh. You said in the Ask Me Anything session last week that you plan to write until you're too old and feeble not to write.
Yeah, that's pretty much now, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how will you know? I've got a similar thing. I'm 60. I'll be 69 this year, and I picture just doing this podcast, well into my 80s and 90s if I can. You
remember Alan King, right? You can keep going that far.
Yeah, that's right. You just keep doing it and then you reach a point where you can't remember what you said in the last show, so you just keep doing the same show over and over again.
And telling the same stories. Yeah, I do that already. But I've written ever since I was 13 years old. I've never written to get published. I was writing just because I enjoy writing. And I often said, if you wanted to be a writer, make sure that you're going into it for love of writing, because if you're going into it for getting published or making money, there's a good chance you're going to be highly disappointed. But if you're doing it because you enjoy doing it, then you'll never be disappointed. And maybe, because like I said, it took me 20 years from the first time I started writing novels to the time I actually was published. So, but for me, I stopped writing because of the fact after about 20 years I stopped writing. Because I felt that I was wasting my life. It was almost like I had a drug addiction. I was putting too much of my life into that aspect while everyone else was making careers and moving on. So I thought I had to put that aside and do something different. But yeah, I will probably continue to do it because I've always done it. It's not something I do for a living. It's just something I do as a living person.
As your life.
Yeah. So it's just enjoyable for me to do. Yeah, I have to create something. I do oil paintings, I write stories, music, anything I can think of. I'm always having some sort of a creative outlet.
Fantastic. I have been speaking with Michael J. Sullivan, best-selling author of the epic fantasy series, the Riyria Revelations, the Riyria Chronicles, and Legends of the First Empire. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Next week's guest will be James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, a frequent guest on the show. He's going to be giving us a preview of information that he will present formally in a webinar April 23rd titled, Are You Fit for the Future? You Can't Shape the Future with Tools That You Don't Have. The cost for non-members of Forrester is $300. I actually invested in that in order to hear James's thoughts on the future. I thought that would be pretty valuable. There's a possibility that James might be able to offer a discount to Kindle Chronicles listeners for the show, and I'll have details on that next week if we have them. Speaking of the future, I have launched a new and separate podcast this week titled Edgecast. It's going to enable me to think out loud about politics and other matters that aren't germane to the Kindle Chronicles. I'm using an elegant podcast creation app named Anchor, and you can check it out at anchor.fm/Len-Edgerly. As a postscript to my conversation with Michael Sullivan this morning, I received an email from his wife, Robin, saying that she had been taking care of his 97-year-old mother, Anna Mae, I think is how that would be pronounced, Annamae, in Michigan after a hospitalization while Michael stayed home in Virginia. Anna Mae's condition at first did not appear serious, but it took a turn for the worse, and she ended up passing away at her home with hospice care Tuesday. That would have been the day after I spoke with Michael. She said she couldn't say enough good about the hospice workers, and she gave quite a moving account of that sad loss for their family. After describing the passing of Michael's mother, she continued in a business-like way to the details of the Kickstarter project, and you could see that she has really helped him out with the business side of his writing work. So I'd like to close this episode of the show with prayers for Michael's family in their time of loss. A Leonard Cohen song I'm learning on guitar contains some lines that maybe might be fitting for the passing of an author's mother. There's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you've heard, the holy or the broken alleluia. Rest in peace, Anna Mae, passed to another world this week at the age of 97. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from downtown Denver. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. Have a great day. Bye.